Walker back again. Okay, I just did a video a minute ago on the still M-tronic solenoid function and system and how to change it. So there you go. Now we're going to go to an old school 394 carburetor. WJ39 this one is, the WJ series. This is an old 394 carburetor. They worked good, but I'm going to show you a function that happens to them that doesn't make the saw start very good when it's hot, run kind of crappy, especially on restarts when they're hot. That's the worst problem with these. And I'll show you why that happens in a little bit here as I go through the carburetor. A friend of mine down in the US, I call him the 394 guy. That's what I got him in my as my phone contact. So, buddy, you're gonna see this. I forget your first name. I'm sorry. I'm gonna show you the function of that 394 carburetor that you're having problems with, or trying to make sure it works right, because you just put a new top end on and you don't want to wreck that top end. So we'll go through the carburetor here. This series of carburetor, they first had this one with the large inlet needle, the large one, okay? Then they came out with a new series, WJ, different number, don't have that handy. Can't quite remember what the WJ, the number was afterwards, but that's okay. They ended up coming out with the small needle, okay? So that's less weight. And then when I show you what happens to these carburetors, you'll understand what I'm saying about the small needle and the weight of it. So most of all, the newer WJ carburetors on 395s, 372 X torque, 365 X torque, all has that small needle now. I'm not sure about the ones on the auto tunes. I can't quite remember, but we'll go over that another time. But we're going to get into the functions and how to take this carburetor apart and put it back together, and having it set right, the carburetor adjustments right, or a basic setting I should say, and how you can adjust them as well, and our lever height for what I call the fulcrum arm, or the metering arm. Everyone has a different name for that, but I've always called the fulcrum arm because it's like a falcon's thing, you know, Italian or whatever you call it. Yeah, okay, so what I have is a nice straight blade snap-on screwdriver. Everyone has their favorite tools, eh? This one is perfect for screws that aren't Phillips. Then I have a Phillips as well to take ones that are Phillips. Some carburetors are all pretty much Phillips now, but some have the slotted screws like this old 394 here for a flat plate. Okay, I have a dental pick. My beautiful daughter, Taylor Walker. Love you, honey. She works for dental assistant for surgery. She's a surgeon assistant. Very proud of her. And I can get these ones that are not very sharp anymore for them to use, or broken, and I can use them for working on carburetors. Great little picks, little points to them, eh? Work great for picking out the screens and stuff out of the carburetor, okay? And you need your carburetor pressure gauge to make sure that it holds pressure. And if it doesn't, it's going to flood, or it's going to lean out because it's maybe got a gasket leaking. So those are the important tools you need. This one especially. You can put this onto the fuel line in the gas tank. Take the fuel filter off and put it on the fuel line and pump it up. Then you can tell if your fuel line's leaking or if your carburetor is leaking. So it's going to be one or the other. So if you take the fuel line off the carburetor and put a little screw in it or something to block it, then pump it up from the inside the tank, you can tell if it's the fuel line. If it's the fuel line, then maybe you don't need to go to the carburetor. But you should also check the carburetor just in case. And if it's flooding, then you're going to need to get into it. Either change your metering diaphragm, which I'm going to show you in a second, or the needle's leaking, and I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so let's get at it. I can bring you down this way to this carburetor. Make sure you can see it good. I don't have any assistants, eh? I'm always here by myself. Boring little Donny Walker gets bored here. Nah, I don't get bored talking to you guys. Okay, let's see. That's pretty good there, maybe. Okay. two different sides to the carburetor. Fuel pump side, metering side. The fuel pump side, the fuel pump operates from pulsation of the engine. This one has an internal hole right here. So you want to make sure when the carburetor is mounted with the gasket, that the gasket hole, the hole in the gasket lines up with this pulse hole. And the gasket also should line up with the pulse hole on the carburetor block or insulator block or carb boot, whatever style you have on the saw. But in this case, in a 394, you got the hard block normally on a 394. And then it bolts to the cylinder here with the pulse hole here. So on the cylinder here, you got to make sure if you're gluing your cylinder down without a base gasket, you don't disrupt this hole. You don't plug that hole up, or you won't get any pulse and your carburetor won't work. So this hole goes up here, into the intake here, through your intake block, through your gasket, into the carburetor. If you ever doubt that the pulse is working right, you can actually just put a little drops of oil on that hole, pull the saw over, and if that oil spits out, you know it's getting pulsation out of that hole. So if it isn't working in your carburetor, then you got something wrong with the spacer or your gasket. Okay? That's how the function of the carburetor fuel pump works. So let's get this side off. Oh, made a mistake there. Always pressurize it first. If it's holding pressure, you know the needle's okay. If it isn't, you know it's leaking. Okay, so if it was leaking, let's take the metering side off first. Then we can tell if it was leaking, you'd be able to squirt some fluid around it, WD-40 or whatever you have, to see if it's the gasket's leaking. If it's not the gasket's leaking, then pretty much you know it's the metering needle. Okay, so 4 screws for the metering side. Have a nice rag laid out. Keep it all, blow the carburetor off first, of course. Okay. Okay, take your top cover off. Okay, set it by the screws, or you can put the screws on it so you don't get them mixed up with your other ones. Now on this side of the carburetor, you have the cover I just took off, the diaphragm, then the gasket. Put it back together in that sequence. The other side is opposite. On these carburetors, when you pull the diaphragm off, just be careful you don't yank the fulcrum arm or the metering lever up. Little tang here fits into the lever there, eh? It's got to be hooked into there to operate right. But some guys will take this as they take it off. Just to give you an example. Let's get the gasket off. Hook it back in there. They pull on it like that to take it off. Now your metering lever is just moved up, you know, a good 1/8 of an inch, eh? Now it's going to be too high and run too rich. So just be careful when you take them apart that you get that unhooked properly. Okay? But I'm going to show you how to set this in a second. So once you got your diaphragm off, and then the gasket, because the gasket goes first, okay? Now you can look at this lever, and if you didn't bend the lever, you can simply put your gauge back on the carburetor. Pump the gauge up, and if you see bubbles coming out of that needle, you know that the needle is leaking. So then you need to service this part of it, okay? All right. So let's, for example, if you didn't have one of these gauges, you just hope for the best, right? You just hope for the best that it does seal, okay? Okay. So now here's your metering side lever and needle. It's not leaking. So now let's look at our other side of the fuel pump diaphragm. Make sure our screen is clean and the diaphragm's in good shape. Again, 4 screws. Take your top plate off. Tillotson and wall rolls are pretty much the same. They just have a different name and different functions in them. It's pretty much the Tillotson carburetor is the same operation. Take your top plate off. And here you have a gasket and a diaphragm. The gasket goes with the cover first, then the diaphragm onto the body of the carburetor, so your little in and out fuel pump valves here are seated properly on their holes to allow the fuel in from the pulsation of the pump here and through to the outlet where it goes down into the needle to get into the metering side. Okay, inspect the gasket. The diaphragm, this is like a Teflon material. This is the newer stuff. Just make sure it's got no little rips or holes in it or heavy wear marks on the little flaps here where they're not maybe seating anymore. This one's in good shape, so we can reuse it. You can reuse these ones quite often. The ethanol and stuff doesn't wreck these ones as much as the older black versions. Here's an older black version, which you might have on yours. Make sure that it's not stiff. Make sure that it's moving around and it's good and pliable. And again, check your little valves. Make sure they're not wore or little holes in them. And you can probably reuse it. If not, get yourself a kit. $20 should give you a whole kit with new diaphragms and the needle. Okay, so we got that side off. Just remember how you took it apart. Fuel pump side is diaphragm first, gasket second, the cover. Metering side is gasket first, the diaphragm, then the cover. Okay, opposite on each side. So with your nice little dental pick or anything else, you can just take and pull the screen out where your inlet screen is, where the inlet of the fuel goes into the metering needle. Make sure it's clear. Sometimes you get a stain on it of oil. Just make sure it's clean. You can see through it nicely. Set it aside. Check in your hole there. It looks pretty clean in there. You can clean all this out. You can either put them in ultrasonic cleaners or just brake clean it. Okay. So that looks good on that side. So we're going to put that side back together, okay? Because I'm going to show you now how the needle operation works. So put your screen back in. Some people use like an Allen wrench or something, but I just use my little thing here. Push it down evenly, and there should be a little hole there where the fuel comes in from the fuel pump. It should just kind of line up there, okay? So that's back on. Get your diaphragm on there, just kind of line it up to the proper holes. You can kind of, everything should match up, okay? Get it on there. Okay, all the screw holes, your little flapper valves are on the right holes. You can see it's all proper, okay? So that's the diaphragm first on the fuel pump side, then the gasket, and then your top plate. Make sure these holes are clear and it's clean, okay? Set it back on, get your 4 screws, just start a couple threads each one. Make sure you don't misalign the gasket and the diaphragm. Okay, let's get this side back together, it's tightened up. You don't have to crank them. It's not a D8 cat. It's a simple little carburetor, just good and snug on each screw. I also put a little bit of penetrating oil in that gasket or WD-40 just to get it a bit moist, so maybe it seals a little better. I don't know, just a habit. Okay, so your fuel pump side's back on, the metering side's still off. So now as the pulse operates as you're pulling the solver, it's pulling fuel out of the gas tank and allowing it to the metering side. So as you got it on the idle or start zone with a choke on, as you're pulling it over with the pulsation of the fuel pump, with the butterfly open just a bit on the throttle, the pressure vacuum will open this needle and push that diaphragm down and let your gas go into here, into your metering chamber, which is controlled. Now it's controlled by your low speed and high speed of how much fuel the saw is going to get. Typically, turn the low speed in all the way till it touches. Just back it up half, 1.5 on this carburetor. The high speed, turn it until it touches. Half, 1 is a starting point, okay? You might want to turn it in a little bit, depending how the saw is running and how good a shape it is in as well. Okay, so your general settings, your fuel pump side's good. Over here, our metering system is still together, and I'm just going to show you on that now. So on this arm, you want to look for wear. Make sure that the back of the arm isn't too wore where the diaphragm was, and where where the arm fits into where the needle is. Make sure it's not too wore there either. Okay, make sure it's moving up and down okay with that spring there underneath there. Okay. Now, I'm going to show you what happens to these carburetors. You see how the needle's sitting in the hole there with the arm? Now I'm just going to take this off. So I loosen this nut just a bit. I don't take it all the way out, just a habit of mine. You can take it all the way out if you want. I loosen it. Push my little rod holder out. Right? And just lift it up with the needle. So there's your metering arm, or fulcrum arm, your pin, and your needle, and your spring. These are easy to lose, so just watch you don't bing, flies away on you. These springs are set for the proper pop-off pressure, or the proper pressure for this saw. On racing carburetors like go-karts and stuff, we had changed these springs to weaker or stronger for different pop-off pressures, but these are kind of preset for chainsaws. So sometimes these older springs, I just give them a little bit of a stretch just to give them a little more strength, just in case it's a little bit wore. Okay, I set it aside. Now I'm going to look down there at the seat. Looks pretty clean. Okay. You can always clean it. You could have cleaned it when you had the other side off, but it looks nice and clean. Okay. So now what I want to show you is why the 394s were bad starting when they're hot. So the reason is this big needle, like I said, they changed to the small one, the lighter one, right? But this big needle, the weight of it and the vibration of the saw, also because the saw didn't have a rubber intake, it's got that solid block on the 394, right? The vibration to the carburetor was physically actually pounding this seat farther down in the carburetor in the casting. They're non-replaceable, so if you had that situation going on, you pretty much need a new carburetor. Okay? I had a little bit of a fix for them. I would drill the pulse hole out bigger so it got a little bit better pulse, and I drilled the small idle circuit hole one size bigger to allow it to give a little more vacuum air in there. And sometimes that would fix if it wasn't pounded down too far. But if it's pounded down too far, the saw will never start properly hot and not really run the way it should. So I don't know if you can notice, but you see how that needle is below this surface right here. The top of the needle, just below that groove where the fulcrum arm goes in, is sitting down in there a fair bit, okay? Now let me show you a brand new carburetor off like a 395 here, or whatever it is, off a John thread. Same series carburetor, same needle. Now this one is way closer and almost even with this casting here, okay? That's the way it should be. If yours is like this one, it might have a little problem starting when it's hot. But this one's not that bad. It's not as bad as I've seen them. I've seen them even farther down on that. And that really makes it hard for that metering lever and the atmosphere or the vacuum to pull it and open it up. So if you have that problem, you pretty much maybe need a carburetor. But you can try it, okay? Okay. So that's why they went to the light needle, because it was less weight and the vibration would not move that seat. Okay? That's the reasoning for the small needle, in my opinion. Engineers might differ, but I think that's right. So let's reassemble it. So you can start with a new needle if you want. The new needles come with a little bit of some sort of compound on it to probably make it seal better. But I put a little bit of lube on it when I put them back in. But we're going to just put the old one in. It looks fine. There's no ridge on the needle. It still moves good, the rubber. There's no heavy wear on the top. So let's put it back in. I put the needle in first. Okay. Then I put the spring in. Watch you don't lose it. They bounce away easy. Then I have the pin in the arm ready to go. I push it in just so it's in there just right. I take it, put this on top of the spring, get the little fulcrum arm hooked into the needle, push my pin over, hold it down with my finger and put the screw back down. Just lightly, move it around a couple times just so the pin's in there good. Move it up and down, make sure it's moving and your spring's in the right spot. If you get that spring off of it, it's not going to function right. Okay, so that looks okay. Now I'm going to tighten the screw. You don't need to do it super tight. Okay. Okay, now everything looks fine, moving okay. Now you want to set the height of this lever. It's like changing the float in a car carburetor, adjusting your float height. Okay, so I've always ran these carburetors even with this body of the carburetor. So the arm here should be pretty much even here or up just a tad, okay? If it's up too far, it'll flood. If it's down too low, it'll run too lean. I've always kind of adjusted them at that, and it works fine. There is gauges from Walbro, or Tillotson has them as well, and so does Zama. But this gauge here is from my old go-kart days. It's got a different height adjustments on it. But I just want to put it on there, just make sure it's level with that body, eh? So that's pretty much level. That should work fine. Okay? After you've put this back together though, again, if you got the carburetor pump, you would put it on and make sure that that needle's not leaking. And then you can reassemble. Let's just say this one's fine, which I know it is, but if yours isn't, then you might need to put a new needle in or clean that seat better to make it seal. Now, putting it back together, this side is the gasket first, where the other side was opposite, right? So gasket on there, make sure it's in decent shape, no rips or tears. And take your metering lever, make sure that your little disc here isn't bent or anything. And then you need to hook. Some carburetors do not have this little tang that hooks into the lever, like Still carburetors don't, and some of the newer Huskies. I don't know why. They got different ways of that. But anyways, this one has a little tang, so it's got a hook into the lever. So take that there, make sure it's hooked into the lever there, okay? Then set it down, square it up to all the holes and the little dowel pins for locating it. Make sure it's moving up and down, yep. And take your cover and put your cover back on, okay? 4 screws. Okay. These were good carburetors. 394s ran really well, but that was the function in the carburetor that made them not run well. Only other things they had problems with was typical Huskies going through switch wires and switches. Even the negative wire, sometimes you want to make sure the post is clean to make sure it shuts off or it even runs properly. Okay, carbs back together. Another thing to be checking on carburetors is make sure your throttle shaft is in good shape. You don't have any wear on the butterfly, that it's going back and forth big time, because they do get wear on the sides. So, that'll make it suck, idle a little fast maybe, or just not run quite right, but it'll still run. And make sure it's tight in the bore of the thing too, and make sure it's operating right, the spring, right? Okay. Then on your choke lever, which is kind of another thing that happens sometimes in 394s and 395s, this little screw for the choke lever here will come loose, and you'll kind of oblong this hole, so now it won't function right. And even this screw can come out and fall out. And some reason, maybe you could get right into the carburetor and mess your saw up. So make sure that's tight. Okay, we'll just check it right now. It's tight. And check your choke butterfly. I can see this one's got some wear on it on the sides. So look at that, it's actually moving. So that screw in the center, make sure it's tight. Look at that, it was loose. So if that falls out, that's going right into your engine. Bye-bye piston. Okay, that's tight, it's closing decent. Okay, choke off, fast idle off, make sure that's functioning right. Away you go. So overall, doing that to the carburetor, this thing should work. They're pretty good carburetors, and there's not much goes wrong with them, besides that function, okay? Or higher diaphragms. But most loggers and tree guys, you're using your saw enough that the diaphragms never really get hard. The diaphragms get hard normally just from stuff sitting, right? Sitting around with bad fuel in it, old fuel. Any of the saw companies now too are recommending the highest octane you can run. The new saws, the Huskies, got high compression, the 385 or the 585, the 592, 572. All the series now have quite a tight squish to them and high compression. So they need the good fuel. You got to get the best fuel, man, and good oil. The bottle fuel, the Moto, or what do they got? Moto Mix from Still, and Huskies got their stuff as well. Great stuff. It's high octane. In the bottle, it stays good for 5 years. Out of the bottle for about 3. Which ain't a good idea, but it's expensive. But yeah, you should use it up. And if the saw is being stored, put that type of fuel on it. Run the saw so that gas is right in the carburetor, and it shouldn't wreck your diaphragms or harden up your fuel lines. But cheap fuel will because of the ethanol. So there you go, $3.94, buddy, guy down there in the States. I hope that helps you. Watch this video later, and hopefully you can get yours back together and running right. I also wanted to tell you to make sure your fuel line was in good shape. Check that fuel line, make sure there's no tears in it and isn't hard, and the fuel filter is floating around in the gas tank properly to pick up your fuel, or it'll lean out, not work right. Okay, there you go, $3.94 carburetor. Keep your saw into it, stick in the ice, rubbing the road. Just talked to Shelly a minute ago. We're gonna have a Thanksgiving dinner up at the trailer there. My mom and dad are coming. I just told you in the last video. So I need to get at it, get this couple saws ported here and get back to work. Have a great day. Check out the walkersawshop.com online store. Take care. Bye.